Hi, I'm Dr. Bob Nicholson and I'm a historian. I'm here to answer your questions from the internet. This is Victorian England Support. Wayward Witch asks, so I looked up if people actually ate mummies. And not only did they eat them, they had the unwrapping parties and also just did cannibalism. What was happening in the Victorian era? It is true that mummies were eaten, consumed as a form of medicine, and that had been going on for a millennia. So it's not something that the Victorians just invent out of thin air. And it is true that the Victorians had mummy unwrapping parties. So mummies would be, shipped over from Egypt and then unwrapped, sometimes in front of an audience that was a bit like a sort of scientific lecture. But in some instances, rich people would do it as a form of dinner party entertainment, and you would unwrap the bandages. But I don't want to give you the impression that people were then kind of rocking up with a plate like they were a buffet and just taking a big bite out of a mummy. So in part, it is driven by a genuine fascination for ancient Egyptian history and culture, but also I think a real lack of reverence for respecting that culture by, leaving it where it belonged. Sometimes they were grinding them up and using them in paint. There is a particular pigment called mummy brown that was used by several artists in their work at the time. Cholera Me Bad asks, you think when a man saw a woman's bare legs back in Victorian times, that was considered porn? Well, yeah, kind of. So legs, feet, and ankles were really heavily eroticized during the 19th century. And it kind of makes sense, because at this point, women didn't wear trousers, so even the kind of outline or shape of their legs is something that you wouldn't ordinarily see in everyday life. They would have been covered by skirts. And we do tend, I think, to eroticize the things we can't see. So it's not too surprising that they were into legs. This is a period where things like can-can dancing was incredibly popular, and it was because it gave a glimpse of people's legs. There's a common myth about the Victorians that they were so prudish about legs that they would cover up the legs of tables and pianos because they were just too scandalous. This isn't really true. In fact, it starts as a rumor about Americans who were considered more prudish in the 19th century, and gradually then becomes one that was told about the Victorians. I don't want to give you the impression, though, that all Victorian pornography was that vanilla, because if you actually look at the properly hardcore stuff, you'll see all sorts of things from sex toys to orgies, gay sex, all manner of kind of role play. So it wasn't all about legs, but it was definitely a big part of their sexual culture. Historical Fun asks, it's amazing how many times Queen Victoria survived assassination attempts. She's actually faster than a speeding bullet or a Jedi. She did survive run-ins with 7 different assassins. Each of them, she came out largely unscathed. Now, you mentioned a speeding bullet, and that's actually the real heart of many of these cases. So the first guy who shot at Queen Victoria in 1840, he fired at her carriage. Everybody saw him do it. They heard the gunshot, and at the end of it, he said, I am the one who did it, but Victoria wasn't harmed, her carriage drove on, and he was of course prosecuted. But the government couldn't prove that his gun was definitely fully loaded. He was using what were known as muzzle loading pistols, and to load them, you would have to sort of tip a bit of gunpowder in, you would force in a bullet wrapped in some wadding, and then you'd fire it. But if you did all of that without loading the actual bullet, and you fired the gun, it would still go off, but no projectile would fire out. So after the assassination attempt, the police spend days looking for the bullet, but they can't find it. So when the case gets to court, the jury are not convinced that the assassin's guns were actually loaded to kill, and they find him not guilty. Unfortunately for him, his defense did too good a job at convincing the jury that he was mad, so he was then committed to an asylum where he spent the next 27 years, even though doctors reported every year that he was perfectly sane. The Pixel Paint asks, was it very difficult to wear a bustle? Could they be put on and taken off without assistance? Could you sit on a chair or ride in a carriage while wearing one? Did they complicate using a bathroom? Did you have to be extra aware of your surroundings so as not to knock stuff over all the time? Right, well, full disclosure, I've never worn a bustle, but I have spoken to historical reenactors who do, and I've got some answers for you on this. So firstly, a bustle was a kind of padding that you would wear at the bottom of your back, and it would kind of extend and almost kind of hump out from your hips to kind of make them look sort of wider at the back. And it would have looked sexy and desirable and fashionable to wear these kind of clothes at the time. The point of it was to accentuate your curve. They're actually much more flexible than you might think. So they bend, you can sit down on them. They're not kind of rigid and hard, kind of iron cages. The big question is definitely about using the toilet, but the practicalities of it actually are not that difficult. So firstly, Victorian women's underwear would often be kind of parted at the crotch, or maybe there'd be a flap that you would unbutton. So you wouldn't have to sort of pull your underwear down. And for the most part, you would use a chamber pot, which you could pick up and lift your dress up, insert between your legs, and do your business. And Victorian women would have done this so often that it would have been second nature to them. While this certainly weren't a fashion that made it easy to do some of these things, it didn't completely prevent Victorian women from going about in public, sitting down, or going to the toilet. Eddie the Shoe asks, when did the Victorian age begin? Victoria didn't come to the throne until 1837, did she? Yeah, that's absolutely right. So the Victorian era begins in 1837 and ends in 1901. So well over 60 years. It's a really long time period, and a lot of big changes happened during that time. So in some ways, it doesn't really make sense to talk about it as a single historical period. It would be like imagining the 1950s and the 1990s were identical. By the end of the period, you've got people looking back nostalgically to a simpler time in the 1840s. Things changed quick during Victoria's reign. Commiseroach asks, what are some of your favourite Victorian era technological innovations, inventions, and why? As soon as we're filming a video, let's go for the camera. Well, let me show you actually one of my favorite forms of Victorian photography. It's basically 3D photography, stereoscopic photography. And you can see an example of it here, where you have two images side by side that look identical, but they're taken with two lenses, your eyes width apart, mimicking the way that we see. And you would put them into a device like this, which is a stereoscope viewer. And you would look into them, slide the image to focus them, and suddenly it pops into 3D. And in this case, it looks like I'm suddenly immersed in a flock of birds. It really reminds me of a modern virtual reality headset. And these were really popular in the 19th century, and they were invented almost as soon as the first cameras. You could buy packs of photographs that would show you, let's say, a travel around ancient Egypt. You could get ones of celebrities. You could even get slightly saucier pornographic ones. So brace yourself here. But in this one, the lady does have her ankles out and she is smoking a cigarette. So, deeply scandalous stuff that you could look at in the privacy of your own home. Classical Futurist asks, how did Victorian style, like fashion, architecture, etc., become the spooky style? Buildings that were built in largely the first half of the 19th century were inspired by the medieval period. So the Victorians were kind of looking back to the medieval era as a time of the supernatural and the spooky when designing their buildings. And now we look at those buildings and think of them as Victorian. So it's a kind of chain reaction almost of historical periods looking back in time. The Victorian period is also when some of our most famous and most beloved ghost stories and horror stories were first written. Think about, the work of Edgar Allan Poe, or of course Bram Stoker's Dracula. All of them, I guess, have that classic Victorian aesthetic that we're still recycling in horror movies today. So Traditional Stop 2498 says, explain like I'm 5. How did newspapers in the 1700s and 1800s get up-to-date stories from all over the world? So in the 1700s and the first half of the 19th century, news can really only travel as fast as the person carrying it. So that might mean that actually news from America might take well over a week to reach Britain. As time goes on though, the key invention that really transforms this is the telegraph line. It allows information to be sent all across the world, buzzing down telegraph lines in seconds. In fact, at the time it was called the 8th wonder of the world. And there's a great example of this. Abraham Lincoln is assassinated in 1865. It takes well over a week for that news to reach Britain, by which point America is already in crisis. But when President Garfield is shot, there is a cable running underneath the Atlantic Ocean carrying news. So in the space of 15 years, we go from America being over a week away to feeling the pulse of a dying president. So Vladith asks, what sort of humour would be unacceptable to a 19th century audience? Do we have any edgy jokes from that period? Well, we've first got to start with the elephant in the room, which is this old myth that the Victorians were not amused. That is completely wrong. They absolutely loved comedy. They produced enormous numbers of joke books like these. They printed jokes in every weekly newspaper. So they definitely had a sense of humour. And I've got here a joke book entirely filled with puns, 300 pages. It's called Punniana. They're eye-wateringly bad. Let me read out one of my favourites. So here it is. If you were to kill a conversational goose, what vegetable would it allude to? Asparagus, or asparagus. Yeah. Not great, right? But they loved these kind of jokes. They were known as conundrum jokes, and they were really popular at dinner parties. They also liked jokes about social situations, jokes about mother-in-laws, lawyers, and actually they particularly loved jokes about poets. So here's one of my favorites. A young poet goes to see a fortune teller, and he says to her, I'm poor, I'm hungry, the world doesn't recognize my genius, what is going to become of me? And the fortune teller gazes into a crystal ball and says, you will be very poor until you are 30 years old. And the poet gets really excited and says, and what then? Then, she says, then you will get used to it. Which kind of feels very relatable from when I was a poor grad student several years ago. They also quite like jokes where men would be trying to sort of flirt with Victorian women and the woman would kind of put them down brutally. So one of them goes, a man goes up to a woman and says, "Oh, darling, how I wish I were that book that you clasp so lovingly." The woman looks up from the book and says, "Yes, how I wish you were, so I could shut you up." So yeah, they loved comedy. The idea that the Victorians were sort of terminally serious and dour and not amused is not true. Equal Temporary 1326 argues, is Jack the Ripper so well remembered because it happened in London during the Victorian era, where the newspaper business had been just invented shortly before the murders occurred? So newspapers go back way before Jack the Ripper, but this was certainly a time when kind of mass journalism was absolutely taking off. The media are absolutely central to the myth of Jack the Ripper. So it's absolutely true that 5 women were brutally murdered in the East End of London. But the truth is, we know almost nothing about the person who did it, except their capacity for violence and the fact that they wanted to enact that violence on women. The Jack the Ripper that you might be imagining is largely an invention of the press. Journalists covered this story in extraordinary detail. They were publishing details almost every day about the search for the murderer. The media pours all of its fears, its fantasies about London. And so that's where we start to get all these kind of rumours. But almost all of this has been invented by and stoked by the newspaper press, all desperate for a story. The name Jack the Ripper is, in all likelihood, invented by a journalist working for a newspaper called The Star, who we think now fabricated some of those letters that were supposedly sent by Jack the Ripper, that's been built on since by the movie industry, by the Chamber of Horrors. So yeah, that's the reason that Jack the Ripper is still with us today. He is not really a creature of flesh and blood, but like a monster conjured out of paper and ink. Melissa Loaded asks, what do you know about the Great Stink of London in 1858? So this is a point where the City of London had been expanding rapidly. Many people were losing their jobs in rural areas due to the mechanisation of farm work. So people were flocking into London and the infrastructure of the city couldn't keep up. So you've got people's homes, businesses, factories, slaughterhouses, all pouring out filth into the River Thames, and it would pile up on the embankments, sometimes several feet deep. And there was a particular summer in 1858, it was really hot weather, the river had dropped, and the stench of it was absolutely unbearable. I mean, there are stories of people, vomiting as they got too close, of them being unable to work in the Houses of Parliament. It was, truly horrifically bad. And their solution was to build an astonishing new sewer system led by Joseph Bazalgette, one of the great heroic engineers of the 19th century. They laid about 1,000 miles of new sewers beneath the streets of London, many of which are still in use today. It is one of the most astonishing feats of engineering in the whole 19th century, and it largely solved the problem. So a Quora user asks, how did English literature change throughout the Victorian era? I feel like if I was a literary scholar, I would probably tell you all about writers like Charles Dickens or the Brontes, Bram Stoker, and all those kind of greats. I want to tell you about a different form of Victorian literature. I'm talking about popular newspapers and magazines, the kind of things you'd pay a penny for every weekend that would be filled with curious stories, cartoons, odd human interest stories, and competitions. And one of my favourites is this newspaper here, which was called Ali Sloper's Half Holiday. And it stars this character, Ali Sloper, is a kind of odd heroic figure. And every week he would get involved in some kind of misadventure. It would usually be some kind of money-making scheme. And of course, it always goes wrong, but we kind of love him. And we think of him really now as one of the very, very first recurring comic book characters. And he had an absolutely enormous fandom. Hundreds of thousands of people who bought this paper every week. In fact, he was so popular that he had his own line of merch. So you could win Ali Sloper pocket watches with his face engraved on the back. You could buy, this is an Ali Sloper Vesta case. If I pop it open, you can see it's where you keep your matches. And people started to act almost as if he was a real person. They would write him letters as if he was a real character. And so he's a product of this new wave of basically cheap periodical literature that took the Victorian world by storm. So for me, it's not necessarily your big canonical writers that you might learn about at school or read about at university. It's actually kind of cheap Victorian literature that really sets the tone for the century. So a Quora user asks, how did people entertain themselves in the 1800s? So let's imagine you're in Victorian London and you want to go on a night out. Maybe you go to the music hall and see singers, acrobats, performing animals. Maybe you go, if it's a nice summer's evening, you'll go to a pleasure garden and there'll be drinking and dancing and music. One time, in the late Victorian period, they turned an exhibition centre into a miniature version of Venice, complete with canals and gondolas where you could sort of sail around and eat Italian food. Or you could go to an American bar in London where you would be served American cocktails. All sorts of opportunities for a grand night out. If you wanted to be entertained at home, we had a few options there too. It might just be pretty simple things like reading, playing music if you were able to. Victorians also loved parties with a bit of organised fun and some parlour games. And my favourite bit of those games actually were the forfeits. So the forfeit might be something like, kiss the woman that you most admire, but find a way to conceal it. And they suggest the only way to do it was to kiss every woman in the room. So plenty of fun to be had, whether you're at home or out in the city. Marxist8 asks, and with an E, made me curious about hygiene during the Victorian era. Urine to wash clothes stank. Yeah, so throughout history, urine has been used to clean things, including clothes, and that's because it contains ammonia, which actually we still use in all sorts of cleaning products today. But I don't want to give you the impression that Victorian families were just loading up their weekly laundry wash in a massive, barrel of pee. They did use hot water and soap, just like we would today. And in fact, cleanliness was really important to the Victorians. You open up any Victorian newspaper and you will find advert after advert for soap products and other hygiene products. Yeah, while urine was used to clean things, it certainly wasn't the main way that people kept their clothes clean. Mad Season 1994 asks, why was homelessness, low pay and child labour so rampant in Victorian England? Was the economy overall better or poorer during her reign? This is a time of enormous economic growth. We've got mass industrialization, global trade expanding, and of course, the colonization of the empire that brought with it a lot of economic benefits for some people in Britain. For ordinary working class folks, it was a much more mixed picture, and they could be much more at the whims of changes in the economy. So in the 1840s, sometimes known as the Hungry 40s, plenty of poor people lived right on the edge of starvation. And of course, things were horrifically bad in Ireland during the famine of that period. So the question then is, well, why? I mean, one of the reasons is that we don't really have a welfare state in the Victorian period as we do now. So no National Health Service, no unemployment insurance, no minimum wage. And that meant that a lot of people lost out and worked for very, very low wages. But plenty of Victorians also managed to earn a living, keep a roof over their head. It wasn't quite as relentlessly bleak as some of the stories you might read from Charles Dickens. He was really on a mission to expose some of the social problems in Victorian Britain. So he highlighted the conditions of the poorest areas of the city because he was attempting to get people to drive change. So the appropriately named Victory Porn asks, did you know the Victorians invented the vibrator? It was for doctors to use on female patients to, quote, cure hysteria. Right. Okay. So this is one of the most enduring myths about the Victorians. So they did invent electric vibrators in the 19th century, but they were marketed almost exclusively at the time for men and to treat muscular injuries. Now, that's not to say that people might have got a bit creative with them, but if you read Victorian pornography, you never see a vibrator in it. And they had loads of stories about dildos. So I think if people were using electric vibrators sexually, it must have cropped up in one of those at some point. The other side of this then is the idea that doctors were basically bringing their female patients to orgasm as a cure for hysteria. But yeah, the idea that every doctor was spending every day basically bringing their female patients to orgasm and was so tired that they needed an electric vibrator to help out, yeah, this is not true. So the word hysteria comes from the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus. So it is, very closely associated with women and used as a way to, explain what people perceived as irrational women's behavior. So yeah, classic bit of Victorian misogyny at play there. Maripe asks, what was everyday life like for middle-class teenagers during the Victorian era? Well, it would really depend. So if you were a teenage boy, I guess you would spend quite a lot of your teenage years in some form of education. You wouldn't be expected to work a job at that point, at least certainly not to support your family. And at the end of your teenage years, you might be expecting a career in a profession like a doctor or a lawyer, maybe the clergy. And as a man, you would have actually quite a lot of freedom to move around the city, to go to music halls, to pubs. If you were a teenage girl, your world would be narrower. So you wouldn't necessarily have as much schooling, you certainly wouldn't go on to university. Your life would be more focused on developing the skills needed to be a wife and a mother. But that's not to suggest that Victorian teenage girls didn't have fun as well. But yeah, their experiences would really depend on their gender. The Copper Owl 1 asks, can anybody recommend movies that take place in Victorian London? I love the setting of the 2 Sherlock Holmes movies and would like to watch things with similar vibes. This is really hard because whenever historians watch films, we always nitpick at the tiny details and get really annoyed at the stuff they do wrong. But let me give you some examples that I think are pretty good, particularly if you like those Sherlock Holmes movies. I really recommend a TV series called Ripper Street that came out a few years ago. It's not just about Jack the Ripper, but about the police and kind of Whitechapel in that era. It's kind of like a fun version of a Victorian textbook. If you love Sherlock Holmes, the classic Sherlock Holmes series from I think the 80s and 90s starring Jeremy Brett, it's a bit dated, but I still kind of love it. I also really like a film called The Invisible Woman, which is about Charles Dickens starring Ralph Fiennes, and it's all about his extramarital affair. So if you want to see a slightly different side to Dickens, I heavily recommend that. Oh, and look, I've got to recommend the best one, of course. It's The Muppets Christmas Carol, every Victorian historian's favourite film. The best adaptation of Dickens by far is the one with Gonzo and Kermit and Miss Piggy. I watch it every year. I absolutely love it. And not just because it's the Muppets, it also gets Dickens right. Dickens was an incredibly sentimental writer. It's one of the things that people often find really annoying about him. But the Muppets are sentimental too. They're a perfect match for Dickens. It is a fantastic piece of work. So the thing that annoys me the most in Hollywood films is that they always get the newspaper props wrong when they do things set in the Victorian period. The newspapers will always have these massive headlines on the front, things like, Jack the Ripper strikes again in massive font. Where actually, if you look at the front cover of the vast majority of Victorian newspapers, like this copy of the Times from the 1840s, they look like this. It is an absolute wall of text, and it is all tiny adverts, not even news on the front page, never mind headlines. The Times looked like this until the 1960s. You just didn't get headlines or images or anything like that on the front cover of newspapers. So here's my message to film directors. If you want to put headlines or news stories in your Victorian set film, what you need is a newsboy crying it out. Jack the Ripper strikes again in the voice of a newsboy is totally fine. Do not put it on the front cover of a newspaper or I'm coming for you. So a Quora user asks, could sewer-powered gas lights, like in the old days in London, be used to save energy? So this is true. So there were attempts to try and vent off the gas that would build up in sewers, actually could explode if it was left out unchecked, and to kind of funnel it up to street lamps that would just be on the streets above the sewers, where it would then be burned and used for gaslight. They were kind of a mixed success in terms of how well they worked, but an amazing bit of ingenuity. And I believe there's still one around that you can go and see on the Strand in London today. XCJM asks, why did Victorians think penny farthings were a good idea? And I know why you're asking, because when you see those bicycles, they look absolutely mad, because we are used to a particular image of the bicycle where both wheels are the same size. But the penny farthing was an important milestone in the invention of the bicycles we know today. And the reason that they were a good idea is that they allowed you to ride faster. So every rotation of the pedal with a massive wheel makes you travel a further distance than if you had a really, really small wheel. So actually, once you were up there and you knew how to ride them, you could go at a pretty good speed. It's only a few years later, in the late 19th century, when the so-called safety bicycle was invented with gears and a chain that would kind of replicate that big wheel effect, that you no longer needed a penny farthing. And I guess it's also worth remembering when we see them, up there on these bicycles, this is also a time when people were much more used to the idea of mounting a horse. So the idea of kind of mounting a high bicycle like that perhaps wouldn't have been that unusual. It was pretty dangerous though. The new bikes were called safety bikes for a reason. Cypherly asks, how did Victorians even court one another? Must have a much jollier time than just texting and social networking, I can tell you. Courting in the Victorian era would really depend on your social circumstances. So if you're middle class, you might be introduced to someone through your friends and family. You might go along to the house of a woman that you admired to kind of pitch woo to her and try and sort of convince her to marry you. But you'd have to do it in full view of her family, who would maybe be sitting in the living room with you, kind of watching all this happen. And you'd maybe be hoping, oh, maybe they'll go upstairs and we can kiss or have a bit of fun. There are lots of other examples of Victorians going out courting, going dancing, going to shows. In terms of meeting each other though, there are actually things Victorians did that are not so different to the way we do it now using dating apps. So if you couldn't find a partner through your friends and family, you could, if you wanted, put an advert in something called a matrimonial column. So I remember one I found where a man who was promising to whisk away his new bride to his tea plantation in India, and his only criteria for her was that, quote, Plumpness was essential. You would exchange photographs with each other, decide if you like the look of each other, exchange a few letters as well, a little bit like messaging on a dating app. And at the end of it all, if it worked out, you would meet. So yeah, not actually that different from texting and social networking after all. Let me show you an example. So here we go. A young gentleman, aged 23, good-looking, tall and dark, and in good position, wishes to correspond with a young lady with a view to matrimony. Enclosed photo, which will be returned to, and here's his pseudonym, Minnesota. I wonder if he ever found love. Daisy Fluffington is looking for a user-friendly Victorian slang guide. And she's in luck because the Victorians actually kept loads of different slang dictionaries. And there are some really great Victorian slang terms that I kind of think we should maybe bring back into everyday usage. So one I saw the other day was to say, I've got the morbs, which apparently meant that I was depressed, which I could absolutely see people using now. What else was there? Oh yeah, sausages were known as bags of mystery, which I think is kind of, probably a little bit too close to the bone if you've ever seen how sausages are made. We tend to think of the 19th century as a time when, the Queen's English was the main thing that was spoken, and Americanisms didn't come in until, Hollywood movies. But it's not true. The Victorians loved American slang terms. The phrase to go the whole hog, which we use regularly in Britain now, that's an Americanism. If we say the word skedaddle, meaning to run away, that comes from the United States. There's a great online dictionary called Green's Dictionary of Slang, which I recommend, where you can look up all sorts of slang terms from all different periods and find out where they came from. Raquel McKay says, it's just an accessory, they said. She's talking here about Victorian hat pins. And Victorian women had all sorts of really elaborate hats that they would buy, and they weren't the kind of things that would always kind of rest comfortably on your head, so you needed to pin them in place. But a hat pin could also be used for other things. So in the Victorian period, street harassment was a real problem for women. They would often be approached by men. Many Victorian women simply wouldn't even go out alone without a chaperone. But for those that did find themselves in public and needed a way to defend themselves, well, a sharp hat pin was a handy weapon, the kind of thing that you would always have on you, and that if a man was pressing his advances a little bit too enthusiastically, or was, outright going to potentially assault you, then, a jab with a hat pin was almost like carrying your own little dagger. So yeah, this was a way that Victorian women could protect themselves when they were out and about, or perhaps left alone in a train carriage with a dodgy bloke. Wernstrom asks, when did it become clear to the world that America would become a superpower? Was it only after World War II? No, it happened way before, and you can trace the roots of it right into the Victorian era. So by the 1870s, they already knew that the United States was becoming more powerful economically. So yeah, the Victorians were aware that their time, at the top of the tree would probably come to an end, and that America would be the one to take their place. This is also a time when American culture was becoming incredibly popular in Victorian Britain. So you have guys like Buffalo Bill, a performing cowboy, bringing his Wild West show to Britain, at which point Victorians fall in love with the idea of being a cowboy and living out in the Wild West. You've got writers like Mark Twain, who became household names. You've got inventors like Edison promising new technologies that are going to transform people's lives. So America was really associated with the future, with the new. And lots of Victorians absolutely loved that. So, more than half a century before Hollywood movies come in and show that kind of glamorous side to American life, the Victorians were already fascinated with life on the other side of the Atlantic. Ian Soforth says, I just read a book on Victorian forensics and now I'm as clever as Sherlock Holmes. Like, at least as clever. You know what, lots of Victorians thought this too. I think one of the things that made Sherlock Holmes so successful and relatable is that, in one sense, he's basically a superhero, right? A kind of mega brain who will unravel any mystery and sort of cure the city's problems. But on the other hand, he makes it seem as if anyone could do it, as if it's all just a product of reason and kind of rational thinking, that there is a system that you could use to apply this kind of logic. And Victorians absolutely loved it. So yeah, you're not alone at thinking you could be like Sherlock Holmes. I think that's part of the joy of the character. Spear Blade asks, what were human and women's rights like in the Victorian era? In many respects, women did not enjoy the same legal rights as men. Victorian women in some ways were treated almost like children, in that certainly married women didn't have any property of their own. They didn't have their own bank accounts. It was all owned by their husband, at least in a legal sense. And the most famous example, of course, is that they couldn't vote, but they also have fewer rights over custody of children in the event of a divorce, and you could go on. And all of this, of course, when there was a queen on the throne. And we might perhaps imagine that things would change for women. But even though Victoria was the head of state and a powerful figure, she wasn't really a feminist. She was very much more a traditionalist. She wasn't leading the charge for changes to women's lives. Janae asks, why was openly showing feelings frowned upon in the Victorian era. I think it partly comes from the images we get of Victorians in photography, where of course they had to keep incredibly still in order to get a clear image from the camera. And it does kind of make them look rather sort of dour and emotionless. Having said that though, there is definitely some truth to that idea that particularly among the middle classes, to be in control of your feelings was a marker of respectability. But I don't want to give you the impression that all Victorians were like emotionless robots. Of course, they laughed, they cried, they fell in love, they felt the full gamut of emotions. And while they might not have put them on display publicly, they did absolutely have a sort of full emotional experience. They were humans, just like we are. Well, that's everything for today. I hope you learned some new things about the 19th century. Thanks for watching Victorian England Support.